Welcome to today's Harvard Business Review webinar, From Big Data to Big Profits. I'm Angela Herron, editor for Special Projects and Research at HBR, and I want to thank all of you for joining us today. And I want to thank Teradata for making this discussion possible. Big data is the big business buzzword everyone is using today. But does your company and everyone in your company really understand how to turn big data into big profits? Russell Walker is with us today to talk about just that. As author of the book From Big Data to Big Profits, Success with Data and Analytics, he researched the changing nature of analytics and how business can leverage new data to create new products, services, and opportunities. Today, he's going to show us how digital platforms, including mobile apps and social networks, are changing customer interactions and their expectations. And he's going to share a framework for assessing your company's readiness for getting the most from big data. Russell is Clinical Associate Professor of Managerial Economics and Decision Sciences at the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern University. He teaches courses on the leadership of analytics, big data, and risk, and he founded the Analytical Consulting Lab and Risk Lab at Northwestern. He's a prolific writer and blogger, and his book, From Big Data to Big Profits, was recently recognized as a top business technology book by the Axiom Book Awards. He is also the author of Winning with Risk Management. Russell, thanks so much for joining us today.
It's great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
You know, Russell, I think a lot of people in business talk about the fact that there's been a lot of data around for a long time. So why has big data signaled such a big shift, and why should we be thinking about it as a real turning point in strategy?
Well, there is a huge inflection, I think, that's occurring, that finally companies are achieving a scale. My book talks about perhaps our very first personal experience with big data, which I would argue is the Yellow Pages, right? It was very comprehensive, and of course it was the only place that many companies could market. But it wasn't digital, it wasn't frequently updated, and essentially technology allows just that. The data can be updated, the data can be readily searched and accessed. And because of that, we can start asking questions, specific economic questions, that we might not otherwise be able to ask in a very general data set, or certainly not an analog one.
So we had the Yellow Pages. There was a lot of data in there. You're saying we're getting to the data in a new way. So how is that changing the way businesses think about big data?
Well, I think the first generation of big data in the digital space was to really measure the customer, to sell more things, and this was sort of the first generation of customer relationship management. And of course, some companies experience success with that, and we've probably become very familiar with frequent shopper cards or, frequent flyer cards for airlines. And if we restricted our exploration, our company did, just to improving the relationship with the customer, we'd see the benefit just there, just in sales. But how about operations? How do we start tying that together? And so I think a lot of companies now begin to invert this data and look at things that perhaps they didn't think about before. The completeness of the data has achieved a new scale, and then, as I mentioned, sort of the availability technically is there as well.
Well, I think you have a slide where you show how Netflix was able to use big data to change the conversation.
Absolutely,
with all of us.
and perhaps many of us are Netflix customers. I am, and what I find fascinating about Netflix, and indeed we've probably grown comfortable with their paradigm, is that it has altered how we actually think about media. And I argue that they were the first company to bring real digital surveillance to the consumption of media. And this slide actually is some data that Netflix shared many years ago in one of their public challenges. And it was a question that they asked, which is really relevant in the area of movies. What is your favorite movie of all time? And so ranked, at least to my favorite movie, which is The Godfather, and many others, we then get a list, and this is just a partial view of the data, of all the other movies you would like. So it's very reasonable, and we expect to go to Netflix and get recommendations, and those recommendations are essentially customized. Customized to a particular taste, customized to our past behavior. What I find fascinating about this, and where I think it's also changing media, is that if I'm a movie producer, I make movies, I own the rights to many movies. What is the value of a movie? Netflix actually knows the answer to that in a way that no one else knew before. By this large data set that they've assembled, arguably the largest set of movie reviews ever, they can ask questions and provide predictive answers, at least, to say this movie would generate a certain number of views, or would be very attractive to this demographic. That capability I call inverting the data. We're not just looking at a consumer, but now we're going to look at the actual movies. Those movies happen to be assets. They're someone else's assets, actually. Netflix doesn't own those, short of the small number that they've produced themselves. And so this leads to lots of interesting economic questions. If I can measure someone else's asset, I can put a price on it. And if I can put a price on it, I can control its market, or certainly influence that market, or make the market. And indeed, that's exactly what Netflix is doing. And so if you're a movie company, it explains, of course, why they have great concerns and reservations and trepidation about Netflix's success. And if you're other companies in the digital space, you look at Netflix and say, this is tremendous. I'd like to do what you did. I'd like to create a large data set in my market that measures assets and customers uniquely.
So talk to us a little bit about what every company needs to know about this, and how anybody beyond Netflix and beyond just the customer interaction, how we should think about the big data challenge.
There's a few things. The first thing I do want to underscore is that really customer is king. We're going to see mass customization. So what Netflix did for movies, we're going to see this in social, in mobile, in medicine. So I was just out in the Bay Area a few weeks ago, and there's a lot of discussion about next generation smartphones anticipating not just what you will type, but your searches. And so this ability to include predictive services to recommend things, of course, that are spatially related to your location. And in doing all of this, of course, data is created. The interaction with the customer creates a data. It doesn't just measure that customer. It measures other assets that the customer interacts with, restaurants, stores, things that are purchased. And the movement of this data has created, I say, some dimensions. Those dimensions, I think, are changing and explain largely this notion of big data, how it's different than, say, maybe data a few years ago. One is velocity. The technology exists to get this information much more rapidly. It's just in the news almost every day. Chicago's a center for flash trading, flash markets. And so in the financial markets, the notion that we can get data within milliseconds is changing trading in various instruments. But it's also at work in retail stores. You go into a Target or you go into a Best Buy, and while you're there, you're looking at an item and you decide to search it online. That search through technology in the store could actually be detected by the retail operator. And so that gives them an opportunity to produce perhaps a limited, a time-limited coupon. And so you think, well, that has to be executed very quickly. If you've already walked out the store, the coupon and the customer relationship is useless. We're going to see tremendous precision in the data. As I mentioned, first generation of customer data capture was, did you buy my product? Did you respond to my offer? Now we're going to see sort of subtleties. When do you use it? Time of day, other kinds of usage patterns. And it's going to be very helpful in healthcare and also on operational sides, where we'll have sensors measuring people's bodies, measuring, of course, companies and interactions of people with companies. But one feature that also excites me is this notion of fusing data sets. Data that did not exist together ever before. And an example that I find fascinating is that of Zillow. And so when you think of Zillow, and of course they're the online real estate or property assessment company, however you happen to use them, they have brilliantly, I think, brought together disparate data sets from all the different counties, municipalities where there is publicly available information on properties. They also assemble some internal information, encourage homeowners to disclose other things about their property, maybe show pictures, maybe incorporate Google Map information, and then they apply some algorithms to that. The assembly of that is far more valuable than any one of those pieces. And so now if I want to go look at a particular house or a neighborhood or any region of the country for that matter, Zillow becomes a very natural starting place. And their creation of value is that they've assembled this. And possibly a great deal of what they've assembled they didn't even own or make, but they've done this in a very creative way. I thought it would be an interesting place to share another example. A lot has been said about retailers and their challenge with eBay and Amazon, and of course that challenge is going to go on for some time. But retailers do have an advantage, and that advantage, of course, is that their products are available instantaneously or at the store. But as a consumer, we may not know that. And this was a project that we did with Teradata that examined for a particular producer. Maybe you make a shoe or you make toys or something like that. Your product might be available at Macy's or Walmart or Toys R Us or a host of different places. And as a consumer, I've decided I need it now, as soon as possible. I could call all of these stores, and that would be, quite an inconvenience. I could go to them, and the inconvenience would be even bigger. And it might be difficult to actually determine if that product's in stock. What's fascinating is if you share a common platform, a data warehouse, for instance, all of those retailers' data could be brought together under the purview, say, of the manufacturer. Instead of going to the Macy's page or the Toys R Us page, maybe you go to the toy manufacturer's page and you say, I'd like to know the closest available product of this toy or shoe. Now, when we think of toy or shoe, we think, well, you could probably live with Tomorrow and Amazon or Zappos, but suppose it's a critical pharmaceutical product that you need for your health or happiness. Or perhaps it happens to be a critical part to a piece of equipment, and the penalty to that equipment not being in use, a vehicle or a piece of machinery, would be very high. How could you then search across a large number of locally available sources? That requires all of these dimensions that I just shared here. The fusion of those data sets, precision, the availability to look for a shoe size or a particular product, and then the ability to do this very quickly and to get real-time updates on those inventories. So I think these features are all at work in how we're going to experience big data and how companies are going to see it change. I think about big data as offering new opportunities for companies. So I use this example in my book, and it is meant to be a little thought-provoking, which is, suppose I own a billboard, a real analog billboard up on the highway, and this billboard is one that I would like to rent out to advertisers, charge them a fee, of course, and I might ask, what is the appropriate price for that? And it's probably tied to the number of people who drive by the billboard. Wonderful. Who would know that? The Department of Transportation, possibly, but probably quite poorly. And so what I find fascinating about this in the digital world that we're living in is that someone knows the answer to that technically. Cell phone networks know that. Verizon or AT&T or T-Mobile. By the nature of us having our phone with us and on, it is recording, of course, location. But it also records and knows who we are and other things that we do. If those cell phone networks found it interesting enough to invert their data, instead of looking operationally at what phone calls we're making, instead said, we're going to look at a longitude, latitude location, which is a billboard, we could then look at, in a period of time, the thousands of people who go in front of that. Assemble now some data product or data set that would be very interesting. In fact, it would be very interesting to the owner of the billboard, to the advertiser of billboards, and anyone who happens to want to enter that market. And we know from economic principles that once that data becomes available, there will be a convergence between the bid and the ask price. So, a reticent advertiser or someone who's otherwise unclear about the value of advertising would be more comfortable spending what they would consider a fair price. So, but what is fascinating about this is that neither Verizon or AT&T got in the billboard business, right? And so this is the reality and the kind of, excitement that I have for big data is that we find surprises in it. They're just going about their business running excellent networks, but now all of a sudden they can measure someone else's asset. And if you can measure their asset, it causes various conflicts. One conflict is the asset owner, the billboard owner might say, I didn't ask you to do that. You're invading my ability to operate my business or privacy, perhaps, though it's not clear that that actually would be at work. The intent of that cell phone company might then come into conflict with the asset owner. Should they sell it to a competitor? Should they sell it to the advertiser? Should they auction it off? These now all become questions of strategy. Once I have information about assets in a marketplace, and I believe our digital world is going to create more of those, these questions become quite looming. And it's not just billboards. So if you insert for billboards someone's health, a piece of real estate, any other thing for which markets would want to form around car drivers, like in the case of Uber or Airbnb, now we get really interesting models, things that can be quite disruptive, and at the core they all have these dimensions of big data.
But from what you're saying, it sounds like part of the opportunity and the challenge here is really knowing how to turn the equation.
Exactly. Yeah, I hear this frequently, and this is something that you hear when someone's got a startup. They'll say, I have a lot of data, or I have really interesting data, and someone's going to pay me a lot for it. Very rarely is that the case. What I believe is more the case, you have transformed your data into a product that is needed by a market participant, by a customer. And so in the case of the billboard, if we were to really go run this business, I don't think an advertiser certainly wants to have reams and spreadsheets of longitude, latitude data. They want just an answer. For this billboard, who are the people? And then, of course, the possibility for specificity is there. What is their wealth, income, other things, brands that they might appreciate? That's a data product, or what I would call a data product. It's been transformed to answer a question. And that, you will see, is common in some other paradigms. One of them is agriculture, so I find this fascinating. It's one of the areas that I do some of my research in for big data. And in the U.S., of course, agriculture is really dominated by corn and the Midwest grain products. And so what's fascinating about this market is that about 2/3 to 3/4 of the market is planted and harvested by John Deere equipment. And you think, wow, inadvertently, maybe by accident, their devices now have assembled an almost complete measurement of the crop that's planted in the United States. And of course, there are traders in Chicago and other places who say, I'd like to know that. And in fact, they are interested. They're forming friends on Twitter to say, what's the corn crop look like in Iowa? What should I be doing down in the pit in Chicago? But when I look at that, it tells me that currently the needed information is not being communicated. And so inadvertently, John Deere or other participants, by the way, satellite companies and drone manufacturers, all can promise the same thing. I can conduct surveillance on agricultural land and answer questions then in agricultural markets. Now, if you're not in agriculture, you think maybe this wave of change isn't going to come your way. It's going to come in real estate, and it's already happening in a really big way. And so, of course, this is the John Hancock building, and it recently traded, actually, so change in ownership, and you think it's such a unique building, and arguably any piece of real estate has unique features. So putting a price on real estate is always complicated, and especially a skyscraper like this. If we wanted to assess the property value, of course, we could hire analysts, and we could look at the rents, and we could build prospectus forecasts. I would argue that the value of any piece of real estate, and arguably one as prominent as this one, is tied to the number of people who use the building on a daily basis and what they do. Do they shop? Do they live? Do they go to a restaurant? And who are they? What other things might they demand or command while they're in that building? And so that information similarly is made available, or could be made available, through cellular networks or apps, or maybe even the property manager could intercept the radio signals coming off of our phones and begin to detect some of that information for their own purpose and own use. This kind of shift, if you would, and focus on assets is core to what Uber and Airbnb have done. I think it's going to have implications for taxation, I'm afraid to say. And perhaps
I was just going to say,
yeah.
It seems to me that this is a big opportunity for the public sector. It also could be a way to access data that could probably help solve some problems, but taxation would in fact seem to be a real opportunity here.
It would. Taxing a building like this, or taxing any asset, maybe even the billboard or anything. The cities of North America have big problems, as we know, and you say, well, how would I measure it? And right now we look to market prices, and those are almost never in step. But if I looked at utilization, I looked at popularity, I looked at consumption, those types of metrics can become available. And what's fascinating about it is there will be networks who can measure that as a byproduct of their business. Credit cards can measure consumption, and of course, the popularity of stores or relative popularity of them. And so apps and digital networks and social networks could do the same about brands. Now we can drill it down to a piece of real estate, or in the case of Airbnb, a room in a particular building. And so all the attributes necessary to measure that would be there. Now, what all of these examples I have shared have in common is what I call a digital platform. And what I mean by this is that the relationship between a company or a firm and a customer is through a digital interaction. We go to a web page, or we go to an app, and although the web pages have been with us for some years, these sort of smarter apps that detect and measure our actions without us actually declaring them has changed things. For instance, you go to LinkedIn you check out your post, or you check out who's looked at you and something like that. And so what you have done is essentially shared some of your activity and information for an exchange of information. So I can't think of an example where companies go to a web page just for fun. They go for something back, right? It is really a matter of convenience and economic trade. The example I use is Kayak. So I use it frequently to search for flights. And when I do, I get lots of information. But interestingly, I give something to Kayak. I told them the cities that I'm looking for. I told them flight preferences, time of day, airline preferences. And as an individual, my data point might be, worth very little. But when they do this over millions and millions of people, they achieve a scale and a completeness that says something very strongly about the demand function for flights, time of day, would be very useful to airlines. And of course, since a user of Kayak is looking across airlines, they could then tell other airlines, maybe you should alter your flights. We have data to suggest that that would be beneficial. So this trade is really at work, or this digital platform is critical, and this digital platform will help also in the disruption of markets. I've already mentioned Airbnb and Uber, and indeed a lot of people are focused on just that, disrupting markets. How can we Uberify our business? And to me, there are a couple of things that become critical. First of all, the business has to have a digital platform. The relationship and interaction with the customer has to be one where measurement can occur. And so that measurement and then the execution, and I think this is what's really brilliant about Uber and Airbnb, you don't actually have to call a number, you just, it's very convenient, but everything that you might question, the quality, the ratings, the availability, the price, all become available. And behind that actually is an enormous amount of data. And of course, algorithms and processing, and of course extends to these dimensions I mentioned of fusion and precision and velocity. I also think these are going to become more mainstream. So as we enter into a sharing economy, or expect more things to be available, we're going to react to that when we have information about that. And that information is going to be, as I said, these advanced data products. I like the example also of Mint.com, and I mentioned Kayak. I put them in this cast of so-called aggregators of digital platforms. So Kayak, of course, is not an airline, but it cuts across airlines. And what's fascinating similarly with Mint is it's not a bank. Neither does it issue credit or hold deposits, but people go and tell Mint, here are my debts, here are my assets, please help me. And so any case, I can't think of another place that people have openly disclosed that, certainly not to the IRS. And then if you think to a bank almost never knows both your assets and liabilities. And so generationally, Mint and other companies that try to solve these challenges for people who want to better manage their money, they provide a service. They provide this service of how you can actually, exercise some sort of, financial plan, but they learn a lot about people and their finances in a way that has never been done before. And I think that's fascinating. And a lot of business questions can be answered from that. There's another capability that we should be all aware of, and I think there are issues of privacy and also issues associated with ownership. Probably everyone on the call today has a smartphone, and I'm going to guess that that smartphone is no more than a few feet away from you. And so implicitly, it is measuring your location. But because the phone also has your name and number and other things that you have done on it and a history, this ability to measure a person now is not just a point in time, but sort of like a movie, like a trajectory. What if they done sort of a whole story? And the way a lot of apps work on smartphones is that when you install an app, and indeed this is why companies do want you to install an app versus using a web page, is that they get access to all of that type of information, your location and activities. And so when we start thinking about a retailer or a company and you say, I'd like to have a relationship with a consumer, what's really powerful is if I can have that app relationship. I can have access to that information. And we might all forget when we set it up or install it that we accepted those terms, and probably one of the terms is in there, and so we probably don't even read it. But I think about it when I use Apple to take pictures, and so you say it's great, it's very convenient, and then it geotags the picture, time and day and location. You say, well, that's very convenient, but But what if it's a picture of your child and you think maybe I don't want that geotagged, and who else might be able to see that? And so it raises questions like that, but you can see that this is just the beginning, and we are embarking on a tremendous movement toward more sensors in our lives. Those sensors are not just on our mobile devices, but as we're all aware, wearables have become a big trend and indeed help with a lot of health and wellness issues. And so wellness issues are one of them, but perhaps something like Google Glass provides another level of measurement of what you've seen and videotape or record everything. And so we're really at the beginning of this is what I'm suggesting. And so we should expect a lot more, not just in wearables, but sensors around us. Cameras are becoming ubiquitous, and so the ability to measure someone's location, activities, even companies are researching, of course, when you look at a computer screen, where your eye moves, and do you see certain parts of the screen or the browser, anything like that. The phone could technically record where your fingers actually went on it, so that you could redesign interfaces that are more convenient for people's actual behavioral use. And I think this will revolutionize not just health, but as I mentioned, a lot of the things that we do with our phones and the sensors that we will interact with.
I do have a couple of people
Please.
asking, are you at all concerned that consumers will get very worried about the privacy and the too much knowledge about them, and there'll be a backlash? And should businesses be concerned that there'll be a backlash?
That's a great question. And I get a question on privacy frequently when I talk about this. I look at it a few ways. If I'm a company and I'm dealing with customer data, the litmus test that I would use is, if you use your mother's data to do that, would you feel safe and honorable, and do you think it would be reasonable? And if you think not, then probably you've run afoul of some social expectation in how data should fairly be used. The reality is we don't have a lot of legal guidance. Of course, healthcare and financial services are regulated by law, and there are things that banks and insurers and doctors and such can and cannot do with data. Outside of that, the examples that I've shared, as provocative and invasive as they may be, are not technically illegal. And so there are many open questions, at least, that I would consider. Who owns data? Do you own the data because it's on your phone, or does the network own the data? If I own the billboard, should I lay claim to the surveillance of the billboard? Perhaps. In some places I could argue that. We will, I predict, have some sort of social revisitation of the notion of privacy. Generationally, I see a lot of people who have grown up in a very digitally rich world expect more sharing and openness. And so I think companies can embrace that, but we're not fully there. And so I think that the word of caution would be, would you be comfortable, or would you be comfortable doing it to your mom? Any more questions? No?
No.
So, another sensor that has taken off, and I think it offers us a great lens into what is possible when you do create large networks of data, this sort of notion of big data, is Nest. And of course, Nest is this automated, self-learning thermostat that you connect to your heating and air conditioning system at home, and it promises to save you money. And so it mostly works in the following way. It learns when you're at home and when you're not, and makes decisions to heat and cool, which essentially reduce waste of energy. It's in many ways quite brilliant. And so you think about this, it requires very little programming. People are very satisfied with it, but it creates a lot of data. Actually, on the privacy side, the first thing is that it could probably tell if you're at home or not. And you say, well, there's a lot of people who might want to know about that. And maybe instantaneously they might want to know if there were a problem at your home. Perhaps the police department or the fire department might want to know. But what I find fascinating about Nest is that it provides the opportunity for new decision-making paradigms. What do I mean by this? As a network of sensors that have been deployed over thousands and thousands of homes, say all in the same geographic area, should there be an energy shortage, should there be a peak period that the energy producer could not satisfy, it would technically be possible for Nest to turn down air conditions, this is largely the case in warm climates, to turn down the air conditions to satisfy not a person's problem, but a whole problem of the network. And so that's why I call this a sort of new paradigm in decision making. You extend this a little bit and you can see, well, perhaps I should have differential pricing. If you're not home and you decided to have the air condition on, maybe I should charge you more.
That's a fascinating concept about how you would actually change behavior through pricing.
Exactly. It is completely economically rational, right? So there's data behind it. You could change your behavior. You could say, no, I want to come home and I want the house, very comfortable, so I'm willing to pay that penalty. Or you might say, I'm willing to forego air condition or some other use of energy when other people need it and experience a benefit at times of day when energy consumption is low. There are various models that have tried this in places where energy is not sufficiently produced during peak periods, but they never had this capability, that you literally could just turn off every one of those air conditions. So that now works, or is at least technically possible, and will alter how we participate with companies like that, energy companies, and then of course the importance of sensors. One of the things that I find fascinating about social networks, and it comes up frequently when we talk about big data, is, well, there's a lot of data behind it. Indeed, right? And the one that I think that is economically richest for much of what we do in the business world is LinkedIn. And so I go to LinkedIn regularly, as I'm sure many of our participants today do. And so LinkedIn has, I think, very brilliantly created this free product where you go and there's essentially no cost, and you say something about yourself, and then you can meet other people. And of course, let's call it for what it is. You can find jobs and advance your career or sell more things. And so, there's an economic benefit to that. But in mass, as LinkedIn has created this massive network, it can answer other questions. And so I find it very interesting, and one of the graphics here is from their research team, when we had the demise of the three large investment banks, Lehman, Bear Stearns, and Merrill Lynch, there was a question, where did all these talented people go? And so actually, with some great precision and arguably even some great coverage, LinkedIn could answer that and show you where they went. Well, if they could do that retroactively, I argue it could be done today. So if you're at company ABC and you say, well, my employees seem to be leaving, I think LinkedIn would know where they're going to go before they go there. And so you think, well, this is conflicting information. Of course, LinkedIn takes that information under some sort of counsel, and it's considered proprietary. But if I were a company and I needed particular talent, I worked with a startup company in the Bay Area that was looking for specialists with skills in linguistics. And so you think, well, that's not a field that has a great population. Well, I could find them. I could find where they work, maybe even estimate what they're paid. And then, of course, that kind of individual inquiry is worth something. LinkedIn could charge for that. And so, and of course, the other side of LinkedIn, which we maybe don't talk about, is that they do charge. And if you have a premium product, they charge you for that as an individual. But if you're a recruiter or you're someone who has, a very specific quest in terms of talent, there's a fee for that. All made possible by this network, this big data that they've established. What I also find interesting about LinkedIn is that we don't have three of them or two of them, right? This notion that once we get to one who's very big and capable, it becomes very difficult to supplant that. And so much in the way that, Facebook, there's maybe not an equal to that, right? And so we see this in the professional space. There's another question that LinkedIn can answer, and at the business schools, we're always interested in this. Where do our graduates go? Not just from their first job, but where do they end up 5 or 10 years later? I suspect the alumni office is immensely interested in tracking down those who have not contributed. But more seriously, what is the success? What is the contribution of the university even to various fields? And so I just picked one here, management consultants. And so here are three of the leading producers of people who go into that field. I'm not sure that has ever been answered before in that very accessible manner. And so any field, arguably now, that at least has presence or large presence in LinkedIn or a network like this, we can begin to ask questions like that. Provocatively, this was done also for other university degrees, not just MBAs, and you might say, well, what's a fair price for a degree? Where do you go? What do you make? And so then the question becomes, well, I'm measuring an asset. Back to the same concept I have. What's the value of this degree, this education, possibly even this university in terms of your life? And LinkedIn didn't necessarily start out on that quest, but they do have the ability to answer those questions. I like to look at a fun example. So one of the sports I enjoy following is football. And this is a graphic from Facebook's data science team. And so they assembled, I think quite brilliantly, information about, I think it was around 30 million people who had mentioned that they had a football team that they liked. They didn't ask a question. There was no survey. They simply went to people and said, hey, I like the Cowboys or the New England Patriots or whatever it is. And then they took that information, related it to where these people declared as their home, and created a map of the dominant team by location. And so I share this because it becomes, quite interesting if you owned one of these teams, or if you were an advertiser that wanted to co-brand with one of these teams. It would help you understand the effectiveness, the coverage, geographic coverage, the penetration, the value of a brand. And it also raises lots of little questions. Sort of the East is obviously very contested with all the many teams and big cities. But this is another example of how someone who didn't exactly get into the sports management business, Facebook that is, has a view on the value or the relative value of sports franchises and their impact. If you were a player on one of these teams, your agent might want to examine this for your endorsement opportunities, right? And so, that type of reuse and version, if you would, of the data, I find fascinating. And if we can do it in sports, I'm absolutely convinced we can do it everywhere else.
Well, as a retailer, I would now know where to put my Patriots jerseys versus my Cowboy jerseys. I mean, I have a rough guess, but in some cases it would kind of help me outline the exact area, right?
Yeah, that's right. And a little joke here, but it's a sad truth, is apparently New York Jet fans are not the plurality in any county anywhere. And so you wouldn't want to have Jets jerseys at all, I guess. But in any case, it does indeed lead to those tactical answers. What should I store? What should I put it? At least some of the work that we do in our consulting lab at Kellogg works with sports teams. I look at this and say, if I'm a sports team owner, a franchise owner, maybe I'd like to grow my reach, and maybe there are territories that I'd like to advertise. I'd like to get on radio stations. Maybe I should have outreach or camps or something. So I look at this and it's a little bit like Roman, history. Like, can I make my influence a little bigger? So, technically speaking, you could then develop a strategy to say, I'd like to get more fans. And why would that be important to a franchise owner? Isn't that part of the value of the franchise? Right? And so, if I want to grow the franchise, I want to grow the people who value it and watch it and follow it, not just the people who afford or can afford to get into the stadium. So I think it's got a lot of implications for that kind of creation of value. Some of the things that these examples all have in common is that they raise the question, once I've assembled this data, what should I do with it? How do I monetize it? And so in my book, I go through this in great detail, but there are at least four strategies here that I would mention. One is, first of all, that I keep the data proprietary. And sort of half-jokingly, I call this the Google strategy. And what do I mean by this? It's a tremendous success what Google has done with many businesses. And as I've learned from many interactions with them, a principle that they have at work is largely the following. We assemble new information, but we're very cautious, maybe even hesitant, to share that with others. And of course, there are examples. If you advertise on Google, you get some performance information, but they don't exactly tell you who did the search, and you don't get their Gmail account, but they would know things like that. And so, they're very guarded about that. So I sort of cast this as an extreme example of proprietariness in data. And I would argue if Google were to stumble across the cell phone example that I used with billboards, their reaction to it would be, well, let's keep it to ourselves. Let's start a billboard company. And let's go around and buy the undervalued billboards all over America. And so Google's shareholders might not have a great protest to that. They say, well, you're very successful, and that fits under Alphabet somewhere. So that might fit their strategy, but if we were Verizon and AT&T and we announced that we're going to start a billboard company, I'm pretty sure some shareholder would say, that's not what I signed up for. All right? And so, in some ways, their luxurious access to capital and talent allows them, to exercise that kind of proprietary approach. For many companies, that may not be reasonable. And so then the value created in the data has to be through a transfer. And so maybe one of those transfers is just a trade. And I use the general example of things like Apple apps. So you're on a smartphone, the app has lots of information. Companies pay to of course, produce Apple apps and be in that that ecosystem, and when they do, there's information that Apple shares associated with the consumer. We could more rigorously produce a data product in the way that I mentioned LinkedIn produces these data products. If I want to meet the linguist, or I want to meet any other kind of specialized person, or I just want to provide you a lens into how your resume compares against other people's resumes. And I charge people a fee for that. And that's also economically reasonable. And of course, Facebook and I think other social networks are going to evolve to do a lot more of that. The one that is perhaps the boldest, and this is like a shoot the moon example, right? Which is, why don't I make the data free? And so if you look at Amazon, and I think about this when I use Amazon, I go there, I buy a book, whatever I happen to purchase. There's access to lots of reviews. There's possibility of even reading some of the book. And of course, looking at other books and what other people purchase. And we've grown to become so expecting of this that we don't really appreciate what has really happened, is that Amazon has made a market. And the way that you make a market, of course, is you share as much information about the product that you're trying to sell, and then let the consumer establish what they think their demand or their price would be for that. We see this in other places. eBay, of course, is an equal parallel, but Yelp and TripAdvisor and examples like that. And why I call this the shoot the moon example is that this pays off when you get really big, and then you can use that platform for advertisement or to sell other services, say Amazon Prime or something like that. But it's not necessarily the best solution for a startup, because you may not have enough information to make that platform rich to capture the value.
Russell, we have a lot of people who are
please.
who are saying this is a great presentation, and there are a lot of questions about, so how to. Now, I know you've been underneath the hood of a lot of companies looking at how to leverage your big data. So could you share with us the framework that you use when you go into these companies?
Absolutely. So the framework that I developed is the so-called Sigma framework, and it looks at many dimensions for the readiness of a firm to monetize big data. First, I look at the sources of big data. And that, to me, it's not just about customer data. Can I bring data from outside? And if I were LinkedIn, we're looking at them, you say, well, they bring in information about universities or employers. And so this marriage, like I talked about, of data or fusion that Zillow has is also there. I look at a couple of almost mindsets. Is the company really oriented to innovate and grow with data? And what I mean by this is a lot of companies have collected data over years because it's required. This is especially true in the case of healthcare and one of my former industries, financial services. And if you're in operations, you say, I have to get this for reasons or accounting. But do I ever look at that data with the ability to explore? Do I look at it to say, I can actually find answers to interesting questions? And so empowering the team to do that, I think, is really important. So I think having a perspective on innovation and growth within the company is critical, particularly as it relates to data. And that means, of course, having the right talent that can do that. The other, and just about every example I mentioned here, is about disrupting or creating a new market. And so I'm not sure that the next Uber, whatever that might be, is going to necessarily change or create a new market as much as they're going to bring information to an existing market. And so to me, that is right back to asset surveillance. If I have a business, I have a network of apps or sensors or whatever these happen to be where I'm measuring customers, can I also say something about assets, someone else's assets? And if I can do that, it suggests to me that you're on the right footing for disruption, where you can price that asset, and that means that perhaps you trade that information. So I call that market opportunities. How can you answer questions, economic questions, indeed, that exist in the marketplace, but currently are unanswered? And so that becomes one of the dimensions. And then probably most importantly is that you've assembled the right team of analysts, and that you have not just the people, but the analytics, the capabilities. Of course, there's hardware like data warehouses and of course, algorithms and software. But most of that happens around a team. And companies now have assembled so-called data science teams and data scientists, people who can both do the algorithms and programming and exploration. And so I think looking holistically at these capabilities, and at least I differentiate some of these levels, and so you can appreciate as you do more in any one of these dimensions, your capabilities grow.
A number of people are really drawn to that one on focus on asset surveillance. Are there very many companies who really understand how to do that right now?
I don't think so. I think for most companies, that remains a surprise. So the example I gave of the billboard or say of John Deere, I think is an immense surprise. Let's think about an example in healthcare. So you want to treat, I don't know, let's say you wanted to treat pain in particular or high blood pressure, something that's particularly prevalent across millions in the population, for which there are many pharmaceutical products and competing products that could be offered. So if I'm a insurance company and I look across millions of people in my network and I see their performance, not just on the ailment that they're trying to be treated for, but I might look at secondary effects, right? And so maybe it's the reality that a particular pharmaceutical product is better for a certain ethnicity or a certain age or any sort of selectivity, and that selectivity may not have been established. In fact, I would argue the pharmaceutical companies would not want to suggest that their product is singularly best for a particular niche market. The insurance companies could establish that. They could effectively say which of these products performs best as the outcome for the people that we see in our network. That's another example of asset surveillance. I'm conducting surveillance on those pharmaceutical products. The pharmaceutical company didn't exactly ask me to do that. And I didn't exactly go about starting that. I'm just ensuring my customers, tracking all of the information, but then I have discovered a new solution, an optimal solution. I think that's fascinating. And I think indeed in the area of healthcare and things like just that, chronic diseases or even complex ones, like depression or something, that combination of measurement of a person's activity and maybe even their social activity online is going to lead to new and better solutions. Let me offer a couple of takeaways that are worth thinking about. So as you're looking at your company and what it can do to better leverage data, I think the first thing to realize is that very few people want to buy your spreadsheets or your database. Now, if they do, they're probably a very sophisticated company, and I'm going to argue they probably would undercut you in price anyhow. So the first thing is, how can you take your data and transform it into meaningful data products? Something that can be answered, something that answers an economic question and can be readily consumed. Maybe you give that product away like Amazon does. Maybe you charge for it like LinkedIn does. And I go through a lot of those differences in the book. We've talked about this importance of leveraging passive data capture. I think this is absolutely tremendous in the world of our digital world. We will have, certainly it already happens in factories, lots of sensors. We won't go actively capturing that information. Sensors and other devices will do this. We won't, as humans, even interact with that data. There will be algorithms that look at that. And so I think if your industry has sensors or interacts with consumers, participating in that passive data capture is going to become very critical. And as we were just discussing, recognize when you have the unique ability to measure an asset, especially someone else's, could be real estate, as I mentioned, could be someone's health, could be the performance of a store. So the examples that we gave can be changed a little bit. So on the real estate example, let's say I'm the landlord for the shopping mall, and I have stores that are in my shopping mall. I'd really like to know how much money they make in my shopping mall, because I'd like to increase the rent just high enough for them to get by. And so if you say, well, what would I do? I could ask them for audited numbers of revenue. That's probably going to be very uncomfortable conversation. I could put a counter in front of the store, which counts the number of people who walk in the store or goes in the mall, and say, well, performance is somehow correlated with activity. And so, those are the kind of surveillance numbers, and I could do that, of course, with sensors, and essentially I've put a measurement on the asset of their revenues. And then I think this is a paradigm shift for a lot of companies, though there are some that get this, and we've mentioned some of them today, is that your data is an asset. And as an asset, you should treat it with the opportunity to grow it, to use it in novel ways. So to me, that's an opportunity for innovation. And when I think about growth and innovation with data, it is not let's all celebrate it and say it, but we actually have to go do it. And the way to do that is to encourage experimentation and exploration. And I think there's a big difference in what an analyst or statistician did 5 or 10 years ago. They were tasked with answering a few key questions. Now, if I were to assemble a data science team, I might still have some critical questions that have to be answered on a regular basis. I would want to build in some time for exploration so that the people who are very close to the data can begin to provide discovery or other insights that otherwise wouldn't be available. And those are the comments I had. I think we've got a few minutes for questions.
You do, and you have a lot of questions coming in, I might say. So let's go back to the whole idea of capturing data. Several people want to understand, where's the problem for a lot of companies? Do they not have the right platforms? Are their websites not capturing the right data? Go upstream a little bit with us.
It's probably some of both of those, and it depends who you are. If you produce a product and you sell it, and your product is sold just through your web page, you would have great incentive to have a very sophisticated web page, and of course to capture everything that a consumer says and does. If your product is sold in like a CPG company, if we were Kraft or Coke or someone like that, you say, well, we never really interact with our customer, it becomes more difficult. And of course the opportunities for that measurement are harder. In those examples, I would say that there are people who do that measurement, right? They get paid a lot of money for it. So, you know, the likes of Nielsen or IRI who actually measure the purchases that come through a grocery store. I've been told by a grocery store chain in the South that they make more money selling their data, that is the shopping cart data, to the companies that I mentioned, CPG, consumer packaged good companies, than they make in selling meat. And so you think, wow, that's even in the South, right? So you would think that it looks like a grocery store, but one of its big revenues is data. And so this ability then to conduct that surveillance, they're doing that on all those brands.
So for a company that doesn't have access, they can buy the data from someone.
Find a partner.
Find a partner?
That's exactly right. If you're big enough, you can exert yourself and ask for exclusivity. If you're not, then you've got to make a compelling reason. You may enter into partnerships, or you may work with a retailer, and as part of a transaction you might say, I'd like information back on my brand or my category, and so that you're making a trade. So if your retailer says, hey, I need a price discount, you say, well, help me learn more about the market so that I can get better at producing the right product. And so that information, I think, would be very critical. I would imagine many companies forget to ask about that, or don't see that as central to the selling of the products. In fact, the functions are probably separate, right? So you sell the product and the operations team collects the data.
There was a lot of excitement on the discussion board about the idea of this fusion, or someone else called it a mashup, where you mash up together different kinds of information. So can you talk a little bit more about how companies should think about finding those opportunities for mashups with someone, and how you also think about your partners, because this is again a little bit of tricky business, sharing data.
Yeah, so it's unlikely that your competitor is going to share data with you, so that's not going to happen for various reasons. But there is a huge development of so-called open data. This notion that the data is free and can be used by others, and of course cities, municipalities are creating these. I think even some universities have this notion. And so those are fair game, right? And so if you think about even what Zillow did, as time-consuming as it must have been, to pull every one of the many thousands of counties and all the properties and find the right parsing of the text to pull out the value, the size of the property, all of the other details that were relevant, everything that they got was publicly disclosed. And so what I'm arguing is that there are a lot of spaces where we have that disclosure. They happen to stumble on one of them that's particularly big. And so vehicles happen to be another one. There are our activity with governments, real estate, as Zillow has found, and purchases, I think, are going to be another one at some point. So you're going to find that there's going to be sources of data.
Someone asked, are you seeing, for instance, a company is going to people like John Deere, like a fertilizer company? Are you seeing them partner with Deere, or
it would be very much in the interest for a fertilizer company to purchase or to partner with them, because indeed their product gets administered or applied with one of those pieces of equipment. The question then is which pieces of land, when, what time of day, all of those questions. So in the example of John Deere, it's actually a really fascinating one, because of course they sell their equipment and products to to the producers, to the farmers, if you would, who say, no, we own our data, right? And so I think that's probably right, but I could fly a drone over somebody's farm and, arguably, come to some sort of assessment to how many, rows of corn do you have. And that actually is an even more interesting problem. I might not be interested in your corn. I might be interested in Monsanto's hybrid 123. And I'd like to know how it's producing relative to Pioneer's hybrid. And so now let's say I'm a scientist and I want to develop a new hybrid of corn, and of course developing high yield crops is going to be part of how we continue to feed the world. Or maybe I just trade the stocks and I'd like to know which one of these companies has the best portfolio of hybrids. That information now I'm suggesting could be acquired and developed.
So that brings up again the question of privacy, which a lot of people are asking about. Do you have any advice for companies on how to talk to consumers about what they're doing with the data? And are you a big proponent of transparency?
Absolutely, transparency. So I think the Netflix example is a great one. When I talk about Netflix in my executive programs and classes, I do a little survey and I ask, how many people here like Netflix who are users? And it's almost 100% participation. We like Netflix and we endorse it and we think that they're a great company. And I think, well, what did Netflix do? They made it very clear how the information they gathered from you would help you find better movies, right? And so that's a little, harmless space. But what I think is really critical is that if you collect information about consumers and it is your intent to differentiate them on price, possibly penalize them, you need to be, I think, very cautious. So, having spent some time in the financial services industry, we have various rules on this. But if I could use an example, and I use this in one of my classroom settings, I asked my students, well, would it be fair for a bank to use information on your Facebook page or other social network to make credit decisions? And so, about 60% of my students will say, well, no, that's an invasion. About 40% will say it's fine. And so, when I probe this a little bit more, it's interesting. They might think, well, perhaps the bank is interested in my lifestyle, or I go to parties or do something that might otherwise, be interesting to the bank. And really, the bank's only interested in a few things. Did you lose your job, or do you have terminal disease? Because that's going to impact my likelihood of being paid back. And so in each of those, we have now an ethical dilemma. If I know that is the bank, and you've announced to your friends for various reasons of support and empathy that you had one of these tragedies come to your life, should I act upon it? And so this becomes another question to a company. When you do have that information, are you prepared to use it? And if you're not, you consider it unethical, maybe you should make that very clear and have some sort of governance in the company about how data is going to be used. I think companies could probably articulate what they expect, but they may not be able to control every employee and every decision within the firm.
So we have time for one last question. Please. Someone asked, do you really think that business schools are equipping people to really handle the decisions and really the growth that's made possible by big data? What do they need to change?
Well, I think we're doing a great job. We get a lot of students. The classes that we have in analytics are very popular at Kellogg, and I'm proud to say the courses that we've developed, the one I have, brings companies and our students together to actually practice and exercise these questions. And I think that's part of what's necessary, because the solutions are going to be, they're going to be changing, because the technology is going to change and society is going to change.
And what about equipping the rest of the people in your company to make sure that everybody's got the analytical skills? Well,
that's a bigger one. I don't know that's going to happen overnight. There was a report, I guess McKinsey did, McKinsey Quarterly, that said there would be a huge dearth of talent, analytical talent. I believe that's going to be the case. And so I also believe that those talented people are going to be harder to find. So if your company doesn't have the resources to do that, you might need to consider some sort of sharing models, or, role of some sort of consultant or offshore expertise. But the companies who say, no, I want to do this, and leveraging my data is going to be important, you're going to have to acquire that talent.
Russ, this has been a great discussion, but I'm afraid we're out of time. I want to thank you. I want to thank everybody for joining us today, and I want to thank Teradata for making this discussion possible. This concludes our presentation. Have a great day.